All right, everybody, get ready, because today we're diving headfirst into a question that's been debated for, well, pretty much ever: the existence of gods.
And we're not just asking the simple question of if they exist. We're going deeper. We're going to explore how all these different ideas about gods, from the ancient myths to like futuristic AI, actually measure up against what we currently understand about the universe.
Right. It's like someone kidnapped a philosopher, a scientist, maybe a sci-fi writer, put him in a room with this wild tier list you sent over and said, all right, make sense of this.
That's a great way to put it. And to be clear, this list isn't about, definitively proving or disproving anything. It's more about taking a look at how these different ideas about gods line up with like scientific principles, logical arguments, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so you've got deism and pantheism hanging out at the top, the S tier. It's almost like you're saying these ideas are like scientifically respectable, they could hold their own in a room full of scientists, but they both come at this whole divine thing from such different angles, right?
Yeah, you've got deism, which kind of lines up with this idea of a first cause, which often gets linked to the Big Bang. It basically suggests that there's a God who gets the whole universe going and then kind of steps back, lets everything unfold naturally.
So it's like God is the ultimate architect, right? Draws up the plans, lays the first brick, and then just kicks back and admires their work.
Exactly. Pantheism, that's a whole other thing. Pantheism finds the divine within the universe itself. It's that feeling of awe you get when you really look at a starry sky. It's the interconnectedness of everything, that sense that we're all a part of something way bigger than ourselves.
I get that. Pantheism feels very, personal, intimate even. It's like you could walk up to a tree and be like, hey, we're both part of the same incredible thing. Which one do you find more, I don't know, compelling or convincing?
Honestly, I think they both have their strengths.
Yeah.
Deism offers a possible explanation for how the universe got started without directly contradicting what science tells us. Pantheism, on the other hand, well, that really connects with people who find a sense of wonder and reverence in the natural world.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so we move down this list and we hit the A tier, and things get a little more heady, right? We're in philosophy territory now, talking about stuff like Aristotle's prime mover and Spinoza's God. It's like we walked into a philosophy lecture, but in a good way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These concepts definitely need a little more brain power to unpack. Aristotle's prime mover, for example, that's a really interesting one. It's not a God in that traditional, personal sense.
Yeah.
It's more of a principle, pure thought, pure intellect, the thing that sets the universe in motion.
So less of a dude on a cloud with a beard, more like the initial spark of an idea, the thing that gets your brain going.
Yeah, you got it. And then there's Spinoza. Spinoza basically says that God is the infinite substance of existence.
Yeah.
Everything that exists, it exists in God, and God is in everything.
Okay, I can kind of see why those ideas are interesting to philosophers, but do they really feel like gods in the way we usually think about them? Or are they more like, I don't know, attempts to understand the fundamental nature of reality, but just through a totally different lens? What do you think, listener?
See, and that's what makes this tier list so cool. It forces you to really think about what you even mean by God and opens up all these other possibilities.
It's true. And that brings us to the B tier, which honestly, this is where things get really interesting for me. We're talking about the classic monotheistic religions, right? Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and they're all lumped in with the idea of intelligent design. It's a fascinating mix, to say the least.
It is. And this tier is really where we start to see a real clash between faith and actual scientific evidence. The idea of a single, all-powerful God who intervenes in the world. It makes sense philosophically, but scientifically, it gets tricky.
Right, because miracles aren't exactly something you can easily demonstrate in a lab. But then you've got the argument that maybe these gods, they work in ways that science can't even detect. Or maybe they just choose not to reveal themselves in a way that we could measure.
That's where this whole idea of falsifiability comes into play. If there's no experiment you could even imagine that could disprove a God's existence, well, it falls outside of what science can really even talk about. It becomes an article of faith, not a scientific fact.
So how are you even supposed to get your head around the idea of a God who's both all-powerful and totally invisible to science? It's like trying to design an experiment to prove that silence exists.
It's a question that's been driving theologians and philosophers crazy for centuries. And honestly, there's no simple answer. It often boils down to individual belief and how you interpret things.
And that, dear listener, is where we're going to take a quick break, but don't go anywhere. When we come back, we're diving into the lower tiers where the myths and science really start to butt heads, and it gets a lot more Interesting, to say the least. Okay, so we're back, and it feels like we're putting away the philosophy textbooks and, like, picking up a comic book or something.
I'd say that's a pretty accurate way to put it. As we go further down the tier list, we're definitely getting into concepts of the divine that are more about, well, mythology and storytelling.
Right, we're talking lightning bolts, epic battles, maybe a trickster god or two causing some chaos. Yep, we've made it to the C tier, home of the polytheistic pantheons, those big, larger-than-life deities like Zeus, Odin, all those guys.
These myths, while not exactly scientifically likely, they give us a really fascinating look into how ancient cultures tried to make sense of, well, everything.
It's like they took all the messy, complicated human stuff, the love, the jealousy, the anger, ambition, and just like blew it up to these huge proportions. You get these epic dramas with gods and monsters and, of course, humans caught in the middle.
Exactly. Think about the Greek myth of Persephone and Hades.
Right.
Love, loss, the seasons changing. It's all there wrapped up in a story about gods and the underworld. Even though we now know the science behind it, about the Earth's tilt and how that affects the weather, it's still a powerful metaphor.
It makes you think, if you were living back then, it'd probably be a lot easier to believe in a god of the harvest than to try and wrap your head around planets and orbits and stuff. It's like science, but with a bit more drama.
For sure. Those myths, they were vital back then. Explanations, meaning a whole framework for understanding the world, all rolled into one.
Okay, so moving along, we've got the D tier, which seems like a real mixed bag of, well, gods and spirits and things.
It really is. This tier, it's all about those beliefs that are closely tied to a specific place or natural event. We're talking local deities, nature spirits, those legends that are passed down, the sorts of beings you find in folklore.
It's like every culture looked around at the world and went, okay, something's happening here. We need to figure out what it is. So they came up with these stories about river gods, mountain spirits, maybe a mischievous forest creature or two, just to explain things.
It's fascinating, really, how these beliefs almost always came from this deep connection with nature. They observed the patterns they saw, felt how powerful nature was, and then they wove that into their understanding of the divine.
It's like they were doing science, but with stories instead. Instead of labs and equations, it was all about myths and metaphors. What do you any of these D-tier deities, do you think they were onto something real, even if their methods were a little different?
You know, that's a really interesting question. Because even though these days we have scientific explanations for so much of what we see in the natural world, there's still something kind of magical about those ancient beliefs, isn't there? It reminds us that how we see the world, it's constantly changing, evolving.
Yeah, totally. But before we get too comfy hanging out with our friendly neighborhood nature spirits, we got to head down to the very bottom, the F tier.
Ah, yes. This is where we land at the very edges of belief, the land of pure fantasy and imagination.
This one's for the purely mythical beings, right? The stuff of legends and bedtime stories. The stuff where logic doesn't really matter as long as it's a good story. Think like fairies, mischievous little imps, maybe even a dragon or two, just for fun.
This tier, it really shows just how creative humans can be. And sure, while it's pretty unlikely any of these things actually exist, they still add so much to our cultures. They've inspired countless stories and remind us that imagination is a powerful thing.
It's almost like whoever made this tier list got to this point and said, all right, we've covered all the serious stuff, time to just have some fun. It's a good reminder that not everything needs a scientific explanation or a deep philosophical meaning.
Exactly. Sometimes a good myth is just that. A good myth. A way to explore what it means to be human, to look at our hopes and fears, to be amazed by what the universe offers, both real and imagined.
But you know, with all this talk about different ways of seeing the divine, from the scientific to the completely mythical, there was that one category we mentioned earlier that I just can't get out of my head. Remember the S tier?
Ah, yes. The realm of the truly mind-blowing, where science fiction starts to sound a whole lot like theology.
And that, my friend, feels like the perfect way to transition into the next part of our deep dive. Be prepared, because things are about to get really meta, really fast. Stick around, listener. We'll be right back after a quick break.
All right, we're back. Man, I'm still trying to process all that. From the super philosophical stuff in the A tier to those, like, wonderfully weird F tier creatures. It's a lot.
It really is quite a range, isn't it? But, you know, now we're heading into some seriously mind-bending territory, the kind of place where even the definition of God gets completely flipped on its head.
Right, the S tier. It's like they created this list, got to this point, and we're like, hold on, what if the most incredible, like, out there concepts of God weren't from these old myths, but from, like, cutting-edge science and technology instead. Exactly. And that's where you get something like the simulation hypothesis.
Yeah.
That idea that what we perceive as reality, it's actually, well, a super advanced computer program.
I'll be honest, the first time I heard someone talking about this, I thought they were just like really into the Matrix, but then I started to actually look into it, and it's kind of freaky how much sense it makes.
Right. And it all comes down to computing power and how fast it's growing. There's some really smart physicists and philosophers out there who are starting to think that it might actually be possible. Like a civilization way more advanced than us could, in theory, create simulations that are so real, so detailed, that from the inside, you'd never know the difference.
Okay, so let's say, just for fun, that we are living in some kind of simulation. Who or what is God in that scenario? Is it the programmers who wrote the code, the supercomputer running the whole thing? Or maybe it's like some bored teenager 1,000 years in the future who's about to hit the reset button on us.
See, that's one of the most fascinating questions the simulation hypothesis forces us to ask. It completely challenges that classic idea we have of God as a creator and opens up this wild possibility that God could be both within the universe, like the simulation itself, and outside of it, like those programmers or creators.
So we're basically imagining a God who's both the artist and the canvas at the same time.
Exactly. It's a mind-blowing concept, for sure.
Absolutely mind-blowing. And speaking of mind-blowing, we got to talk about the other big idea in the S tier, the technological singularity.
Ah, yes. The point where artificial intelligence becomes smarter than humans. It's that point where, theoretically, we could see an intelligence explosion, like a sudden massive leap forward that could totally transform our world.
It's straight out of science fiction, that moment when the AI becomes self-aware. But instead of turning on us and trying to take over, it starts, like, composing these symphonies that make Mozart sound like a kid banging on a toy piano.
It's a fascinating concept, that's for sure. But it can be kind of scary, too. Because if we did create an AI that was that much smarter than us, it's not hard to see how it could be seen as a kind of God. I mean, think about the power, the knowledge, the ability to shape reality in ways we can't even comprehend.
It's like we're talking about a future where the things we create become our gods. And not just any gods, but gods that could understand and manipulate the universe in ways that make our current technology look like, I don't know, like using a rock to start a fire. It's both amazing and kind of terrifying at the same time.
I'd say that's a pretty accurate way to put it. The technological singularity definitely pushes us to think about some big questions. Questions about, like, what consciousness even is, the limits of our own understanding, and really the future of our entire species.
Big questions indeed. Okay, so we've gone through the S tier, which, wow, just wow. But there's one more category on this list, one that just feels like a giant blinking question mark. The broken tier.
This one's tricky to explain. It's like, imagine all the other tiers, and then think about the ideas that are so huge, so far outside of how we currently understand the universe, that they just break everything. They defy logic, definition, maybe even comprehension itself.
It's like whoever made this list got to this point, just threw their hands up and said, you know what? The universe is a weird and wonderful place, and some things are just beyond us, at least for now.
That's a great way to put it. We're talking about concepts like the idea of an infinite multiverse, where there are countless realities and beings so strange we couldn't even imagine them. Or the concept of a cosmic demiurge, something so fundamental to reality itself that it's beyond our ability to even understand or define.
So we're talking about ideas that are so out there, so beyond what we can currently wrap our minds around, that they basically break our usual ways of thinking about, well, pretty much everything. Gods, the universe, the whole shebang.
You got it. The broken tier is a good reminder that as much as we know and as much as we discover, there's always going to be more. There are always going to be mysteries that are just beyond our grasp.
Wow. Okay, listener, I hope you're still with us because we've been on a wild ride. We started with ideas that are pretty plausible scientifically and ended up in, well, wherever the broken tier is. But one thing's for sure, this whole question of God, it's way more complicated, way more nuanced, and honestly, way more awe-inspiring than we often give it credit for.
It's a question that humans have been wrestling with forever, and something tells me it's going to keep us busy for a long, long time.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But hey, listener, this is just the beginning of the conversation, right? As you go about your day, keep thinking about these ideas, keep questioning, and whatever you do, keep your mind open to all the incredible possibilities that are out there, both the ones we can explain and the ones that leave us completely baffled. Until next time, keep exploring.